This podcast is brought to you by American Civil War and UK history. This is for the Passion of History podcast. This presentation is available as a video on our YouTube channel or as a podcast from wherever you get your podcasts from. And just a reminder that this episode has a PowerPoint presentation that goes along with the show. So if you are listening via audio, then please head over to our YouTube channel. And if you're watching via YouTube and you like what you see, remember to give us a big thumbs up. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button. To keep up to date with everything American Civil War and UK history, head over to our website where you will find links to all of our social media pages, blog posts and podcasts. Link can be found in the podcast description. Hello, I'm your host Daz, and on this episode of For the Passion of History podcast, I'm joined by historian and author Abigail Williams to discuss Saint Olga of Kyiv and the Rus. Abigail is currently writing a book for Pen and Sword about Olga, so watch out for that. This is For the Passion of History podcast, Saint Olga of Kyiv and the Rus with Abigail Williams.
Hello and welcome to the podcast, and a very warm welcome to Abigail. Welcome, Abigail.
Hi, how you going?
Yeah, good, thank you. And before we discuss Olga, as it is your first time on my platform, I always ask a little bit about yourself and how you first got into history, because that is the most important thing of all.
So like as introduced, my name's Abigail. I am a graduate of the University of Nottingham, where I studied Russian language and history. And that's how I discovered Olga, who is primarily who we're going to be talking about today. But how I got into history, history's always been a bit of a passion of mine, and one of your previous guests, Jackson Van Newden, we've been to school together like pretty much our entire lives, and I have such vivid memories of him and I competing as to who would be able to name the most kings and queens in classes, just being a little bit competitive with history. And then I think I kind of fell out of love with it as I got a little bit into my teenage years and decided to study it at uni because, again, I kind of loved it all my life and thought it was a bit of a worthwhile pursuit and I didn't know what to do after sixth form. And yeah, ended up truly being obsessed with the Rus, Saint Olga of Kyiv. And that's how I'm here today in a really short Sparks Notes edition.
Awesome. We're going to be talking about, obviously, Saint Olga of Kyiv. But first, can you give us a little bit of background, Abby, about the Rus? They're standing in Europe at the time, please.
Yeah, no, of course. So the Rus is often not known to many people, but it is the precursor state to modern Ukraine, Belarus and Russia, and was a medieval East Slavic state centered around Kyiv in modern day Ukraine, and basically started as it was founded in Kyiv as the Kingdom of the Rus, but the way we get to the Rus is through Varangian Scandinavians, which, for lack of a better way of describing it, are Scandinavian Vikings who didn't travel down to Britain, but travelled down to the Mediterranean and the Byzantine Empire and the Abbasid Caliphates and the markets in the southern hemisphere. So essentially we have this group of like warrior Varangians coming into the forested steppe and basically starting these settlements along the north-south trading route that consolidated into a political entity that was the Rus in Kiev, because as you can see on this map, where Kiev is on the river Dnieper, which essentially whoever controls the river Dnieper controls all of the flow of trade down to the southern markets. So to whichever clan, warrior tribe of Varangians held Kiev, basically had a monopoly on trade. So the clan that this happened to be was the Rurikid clan, with the progenitor Rurik, who had a son Igor, who Olga went on to marry. So she marries into the Rurikid dynasty that has established the Rus. But at this time, the Rus is a real fledgling state. It hasn't got a massive central administration. It's considered by modern standards to be quite legendary. We don't know officially how it started, but Olga and Igor, the married couple, and Sviatoslav, her son, they are the first kind of historically legitimate people that we know about and can prove their actions. So we know that they definitely were part of the Rus as it was coming into a political entity that we later know today as the Kievan Rus.
Okay, thank you for that information. Could you give us an introduction to Saint Olga of Kyiv, please?
Yeah, so Saint Olga of Kyiv is the first female queen, first regent queen of the Rus. As I've said, she married Igor, who was the son of Rurik, the first founder of the Rus. And she became regent after her husband was killed by Prince Mal of the Derevlians, who were a Slavic tribe who occupied current-day Khorasan in Ukraine, which at the time the capital city was Iskorsistan, in the land of Derevlia. So she took on the regency for her infant son, who we believe was about 3 years old at the time, but because we don't really know much about Olga, we don't know when she was born, we don't know her family lineage, we don't know where she was born, what her ethnicity is, whether she was Scandinavian, whether she was Slavic. We know very little, except for in 903 she married Igor, in 945 she became regent queen, and she reigned for 11 years before her son took over. So we know a lot about her contextually, but we don't know a lot about her concretely.
So you're writing a book, Abby, about Olga. So what inspired you to write a book about her in the first place?
So when I was contacted by Pen Sword, who is publishing my book, which I'm very grateful for,
Wow.
shout out to them, they asked me if I could write, because I studied Russian language at university and studied primarily Russian historical figures, and I'd been writing a lot about Soviet history in the Historians magazine, where they read my work. They had contacted me to potentially write a book about a Russian female figure, and as I was looking across, all the incredible females in Russian history specifically, the one that stuck out the most for me was Olga. Now, she isn't part of Russian history, she is part of the Rus history, and obviously Russia does come as is part of the history of Rus, but so is Ukraine and so is Belarus. So it'd be a massive disservice for me to say Olga is a Russian figure. She is also a Belarusian figure, she is also a Ukrainian figure. But the opportunity to speak about Olga and to write about her became so deeply interesting to me because of this kind of, we don't know anything about her. So it kind of became a little bit of a mystery for me to solve. As I was delving in and I'd got my editor's approval to write about her, I got more and more invested and realized what a mammoth task writing a book about someone we don't know anything about is. But that's how I started writing about Olga.
Awesome. So, what were some of Olga's notable contributions to the Rus culture and society?
So, I think the main one that people, if they've heard of Saint Olga of Kyiv, or even just they hear the name Saint Olga of Kyiv, they think of a religious connotation. So I think the first one to point out would be her efforts and contributions to Christianizing the Rus. Prior to 988, when her grandson Vladimir Christianized the Rus and brought it into the Orthodox fold in collaboration with the Byzantine Empire. The Rus was a state made up of Slavic and Scandinavian traditions, with different pantheons of gods. So the church obviously wanted to Christianize the Rus, and I think Olga was their gateway into being able to get a foothold into the Rus. They'd made different political treaties throughout their history, because the Rus, as a Varangian Viking tribe of people, made many attempts at attacking the Byzantine Empire, so there was need for peace treaties. But I think her notable contribution from a religious sense, and the one she's most remembered for in a contemporary audience, is her contributions to Christianizing, because her son didn't become Christian, but her grandson did. So she definitely had influence over her family there. But I think the most notable contribution to the culture and society of the Rus is one that is often glossed over because it's not as exciting as the rest of her history. She went on the massive revenge plot for the murder of her husband, and it kind of pales in, like, what I'm about to say pales in comparison to that. So she really, really helped to start a trend of centralizing tribute, which is how it's almost like a really quite, I don't want to say prehistoric, but I'm going to use that word, version of taxes. So local clans and tribes, Slavic tribes that fell under the Rus's territory, had to pay a tribute to the ruler in Kiev for protection, for trade, for multiple reasons, just so that they wouldn't invade technically. And this is how her husband died, because he tried to collect tribute from the Derevlians twice. He got a little bit greedy there. So they attacked him in retaliation. So Olga set up these different ways to collect tribute without the ruler having to go into these tribes to collect it, and it became a more centralized version, which really, really helped to consolidate the Rus as a political entity. And rather than this warlord over these different tribes, it helped to set up the Rus to become what it would be, and as successful as culturally and historically vibrant as it was. So I think that's one of her biggest contributions, which is often not discussed or attributed to her.
Thank you for that. Okay, so how does St Olga's story challenge or reinforce traditions of gender roles for her time?
Okay, so this is a really, really interesting question, because you can look at gender roles in three different ways when looking at Olga. You can think of the really contemporary idea of the medieval period being this grand history of men and male kings and strong masculine Vikings going on raiding and pillaging, all of that stuff. So, and then you think, oh, okay, Olga was the regent queen of a Viking warrior tribe for 11 years, and she was successful. She did a great job. So from our perspective, challenging our own preconceived notions and conceptions of what the Rus would have been, she drastically challenged gender norms, because we don't see many other women leading not just a country, but she led an army. She laid siege, 100-day siege to the city of Iskorsistan in the capital of Derevlia, to avenge her husband, and the Varangians followed her. That massively challenges gender norms. But what I think is also interesting is the way she challenges gender norms within Slavic and Scandinavian tradition and norms. So in Slavic tradition, when a male died, his wife was expected to lay down on a pyre and kill herself as well. She was supposed to burn herself. And we have note of this from a lot of Islamic travelers who made note of this tradition. And it is also reflected in the Hindu tradition of sati, which is a ritualistic way of a female killing herself in honor of her husband. So Olga didn't do that. She didn't lay down on a funeral pyre and burn to death with her husband, or in memory of her husband, because her husband died abroad from Kiev and she was in Kiev at the time. So in that way, she challenges gender norms, but she also reinforces the gender norms, because in her revenge, she burns to death some foreign dignitaries and envoys from the Kingdom of Derevlia, who she holds responsible for her husband's death. So she reinforces that norm by choosing someone to volunteer to take her place. So she challenges it, but she reinforces it. And the same is for Scandinavian precedent and gender norms as well. So there's a tradition called ship burial, which is where notable Scandinavian Varangians would bury themselves in a ship close to an embankment or a shore, and this was a homage to their traditions. Usually a female would bury her husband in the ship, and then she would enclose herself in with a lady's maid, but with clothes and food and other important items to her husband, and she would perish in being buried alive in a ship. Also in Olga's revenge, she gets envoys from Derevlia to be carried in their ship into a hole in the ground where she buries them alive. So although she herself personally doesn't fulfill the typical gender norm of burying herself for her husband, she chooses a volunteer and carries on that tradition. So we see aspects of her subverting, but also reinforcing the gender norms and expectations of a wife and of a wifely duty at the time. So she's a really, really complex character, and she's just not given enough credit for her complexities and her dualities.
Wow, that's great answer. But yeah, I didn't really think about that. I mean, you think through history, but again, this is a man's world at the time, without being, trying to be sexist or anything like that. But it really was, and so to be able to rule for that long, wow, that's quite amazing. Now, obviously, this time period, it's probably very, very hard, particularly, and you're going to tell us this in a minute, Abby, of finding primary sources. How hard has that been so far for you? And tell us about, how you've been going about doing that.
It's incredibly difficult. So the only source we have that mentions Olga in her history is a source called The Tale of Bygone Years, which comes from the opening line of the chronicle, which is So the chronicle opens with, this is the narrative of the tale of bygone years. So this is where we get the name, but it has been translated by historians as the Russian Primary Chronicle, and it is colloquially known as the Russian Primary Chronicle. I do take issue with calling it as such, because it insinuates that the history of the Rus is only a history of Russia, and kind of completely disregards it as being a history of Ukraine and Belarus also. So trying to stick to the name Tale of Bygone Years is, I think, incredibly important and a contemporary assessment of the period. But that's issue with the source itself. The source itself also has so many issues. It was written by Christian compilers in around the 11th century, and there were very few native sources from the Rus that survived into the 11th century for Christian compilers to actually create a history from, because the Slavic and Scandinavian peoples were a people of primarily oral culture. Their community learnt through storytelling, through sagas, through epics, which weren't written down. There's the only way that really written culture was brought into the Rus was through the church, through Vladimir in 988. So there's still 2 generations gap, even from the very beginning of inception of a written culture in the Rus, from when we were writing about Olga, but then we don't actually write about Olga until the 11th century. So there's a lot missing there. And we also have to consider the bias of Christian compilers. What was their agenda when they were writing? I think for Olga especially, because they don't list who she was, they don't list when she was born, they don't tell us her ethnicity, they don't tell us her family lineage. They just tell us that she was a really, really horrible heathen pagan who killed loads of people in revenge, but then she converted to Christianity, and she is a wise ruler as a Christian queen. So we have this duality in her of the compilers were probably writing about Olga's pagan past as a way to communicate to a wider, recently Christianized audience of the Rus that regardless of your sins, you will still be forgiven and you will still be able to enter the kingdom of heaven as Jesus died for our sins, etc., etc. So the primary chronicle, the Tale of Bygone Years, is a primarily religious document, a hagiographical text used for spiritual communication. So although it is our only text about Olga, spare a couple of mentions of her in the De Administratio Imperio, which is the Byzantine chronicle about Olga's time in the Byzantine Empire and with Emperor Constantine in around 950. We don't have anything else to go by, so we have to really dig into those biases and read between the lines.
Mm-hmm. And so where do you actually, how are you able to get hold of this information,
So we have translations from the Tale of Bygone Years. A couple of these chronicles do survive today. We do have a couple. We have the Laurentian, I've forgotten the names of the other 2, that's really bad of me, but we do have a couple of copies. They have been translated, and as I don't speak Old Church Slavonic, we have to rely on translators. So that's an issue unto itself, because a translator also has bias. Translation is massively subjective. One can hope that they've stuck to the source material as much as possible. But yeah, no, we do have to rely on the Tale of Bygone Years. Luckily, I was able to access this during my degree, so I have a electronic copy of it. But yeah, no, I think you can find it online, I'm pretty sure.
Wow, it's fantastic that you're doing all this work, because it must be really hard work, and I know you'll talk about it a little bit towards the end there. But so how did Olga's actions impact political landscape of Kievan Rus?
No worries. So the very fact that she laid siege to 100-day siege to Derevlia, to Iskorsistan, massively impacted the political landscape of the Rus, because she asserted herself as someone to not be messed with, to be taken seriously, to really say, hey, if you don't do as I say in the way I want to, I will be taking action, and it will be swift. I think she definitely asserted herself, and she did a great job of it. But also, as I've mentioned, with the creating a more of a centralized taxation system, she actually created a political kingdom. She didn't create it herself, but she definitely laid the groundwork for the Rus to be not just an unstable, centralized group, dynasty over different clans. She established it as a political entity that grew to become what it did in later times, into the 13th century, before the Mongol invasion.
Mm-hmm. And I'll ask the correct question this time because I accidentally missed that one. Can you share any surprising or lesser known facts about Saint Olga that you discovered during your research?
I can, and this one isn't a fact. It's more of an unsubstantiated theory that really, really makes me excited to be a little bit of a historian again, because it's an unproved theory that I can see the positive and negatives for. So in the history of the Rus, I've mentioned Rurik being the first leader. He is considered quite a legendary character, and when he died, he left his son Igor, who was also a child at the time, in the hands of one of his retinue, Oleg. And Oleg went on and basically ruled in Igor's stead. He was an incredibly important character who took himself very seriously, didn't want and believed in prophecy and sorcery and magic. So a prophecy had been written about him that he was going to die by the hand of his horse. So he was very, very wary of dying and losing power, which is where I think this theory lends credence. There is a theory, because we don't know who Olga is, who she came from, that Oleg is her father, because the Tale of Bygone Years distinctly says that in 903, Igor married Olga under Oleg's instruction. Olga was called from Pskov in contemporary Russia to marry Igor. Why would somebody from Pskov be called to marry Igor and not someone in Kiev or someone from Scandinavia to cement that kind of tie to the homeland, as one could say? So I think Oleg continued to rule until 911. So the fact that or 913, I do apologise. So I think there is credence to this theory that Olga was Oleg's daughter and he married Olga to Igor to cement his own power so he could stay in power, even though Igor, the rightful ruler of the Rus, would step up. But also, we just don't know. There's no proof to prove that. That is just complete speculation. I love the speculation though, because it's fun. But I can't disprove or prove that in any way. It's just fun to think about.
Awesome. Yeah, I agree. And so how does St. Olga's legacy continue to influence modern day perceptions of women in leadership roles?
So, unfortunately, I don't think Olga is remembered in the popular sphere. So I don't think she impacts people's understanding and perception of women in leadership roles. But I do hope, and I know that there are some other historians working on Olga at the moment, I hope that with a continued re-examination of Olga and the medieval period in general, because it's important to understand that women have been written out of a vast majority of medieval history, not just medieval history, all history. I hope that this continued re-examination of Olga really, really does help give people a better understanding of women and their leadership in medieval times, because we do have other incredibly influential women of the period. We have Eleanor of Aquitaine. She was incredibly important to the Crusades. So there are women in power. We just don't know about them in popular history. We tend to still focus on the male grand rulers and great men in history, but I do think there is a resurgence and a want to know about female rulers. So I think we're moving in the direction of Olga being incredibly influential to how people view female leadership in the period. We just need to get there.
Mm-hmm. And it must be incredibly exciting for you to be able to add to that history in a way.
It is exciting. It's terrifying as well, because you don't have people to kind of back up your opinions. You're not being able to delve into the historiography and really side with other historians who wade in onto the debate of what they believe, what they don't believe. I feel like I'm kind of wading in and hoping for the best and hoping people like what I'm writing. Obviously, I'm not making things up. I wouldn't do that. I am sticking very, very true to what I'm seeing in the history. But it's incredibly exciting, but it's also a little bit nerve-wracking.
I can imagine, yeah. But, okay, what ways did St. Olga's conversion to Christianity shape her reign and trajectory of the Rus state?
So I think to answer the first part of that, the trajectory of her reign, I think, as I've said previously about the tale of bygone years, it's written by Russian chroniclers, Christian chroniclers. So, of course, in the sources, her conversion to Christianity is going to be massively defining of her reign. It's a massively important part in the chronicle. It takes up a great many pages, and we have comments about Emperor Constantine saying how wise and how grand of a ruler Olga is. So you can definitely see the compilers of the Tale of Bygone Years who really see the trajectory of her reign being defined by this conversion to Christianity. But the skeptic in me is a little bit on the fence of whether she converted to Christianity for her faith, or whether she converted to Christianity for the political benefits of a conversion and therefore an alliance with the Byzantine Empire, who were incredibly influential at the time, and if they had so wished, definitely would have had the manpower to expand into the Rus. So I think there's a lot to speculate there, whether her reign was defined by her conversion to Christianity, whether it changed the course of her reign. I do think even if there was faith in her conversion, she was a faithful Christian. I do believe that she was also aware of the political benefits. You don't be such a strong ruler for 11 years without being politically savvy. But I definitely think it changed the trajectory of the Rus. I think her son didn't accept Christianity, but I definitely think it helped lay the groundwork for her grandson Vladimir to choose the Orthodox Christianity, because we see in the primary chronicle he calls embassies and envoys from all different types of religions in 988 to kind of sample them all. He pulls a Catholic envoy, he pulls a Islamic envoy, a Jewish envoy, and an Orthodox Christian envoy to come and explain their religion, and so he can decide which one he wanted to convert to. So I definitely think his grandmother's connection with the Orthodox faith and relationship to the Byzantine Empire definitely helped him choose the Byzantine Empire and their faith, the Orthodox faith. So I think it definitely has a lot of weight in the trajectory of the Rus, but as to why that trajectory happens is up for debate.
Mm-hmm. And I know you mentioned Vladimir there, which is so could you just elaborate on St. Olga's relationship with her grandson, Vladimir the Great, and its significance in Rus history?
So there isn't much written about her relationship with her grandson in the Tale of Bygone Years, our primary source. So we don't know whether they were close. We don't really know, unfortunately. But what we do know is Vladimir's mum is Olga's handmaiden. So I think there is some connection that Vladimir would have held Olga in a high regard because of how closely his mum was related with Olga, because Vladimir was one of many children, and he was victorious in a very bloody succession battle, which sees the martyrdom of Saints Boris and Gleb, holy martyrs equal to the apostles. They come from this succession battle. So I think they definitely had a relationship. I couldn't tell you what that relationship was, but there is definitely an inclination to say that she impacted his decision making, especially with regards to the Orthodox faith. Couldn't say anything more than that.
Excellent, thanks. Okay, so how do contemporary historians interpret St. Olga's motivations and actions, considering the limited historical sources available?
Historically, her actions have been regarded with a little bit of skepticism. She's kind of been disregarded as a legendary figure whose revenge didn't happen. It was kind of made up, not really historically accurate, so no really point looking at it. She's only seen as legitimately important when we see her in the Byzantine court converting to Christianity, because she is written of in the Byzantine sources as well. So before this time, before 945, she's kind of considered to be a bit of a non-entity, a little bit of a figure that you can kind of be like, oh yeah, there was Olga, but cool, we'll move on to Vladimir, or we'll move on to her conversion. And that's really all that's people have thought about her. She's definitely been a footnote in the grand history of men, and I think that does a real disservice to how we look at the tale of bygone years, because although we can't always verify the historical record, and it would be impossible to verify the historical record without archaeological evidence, and we are finding more and more archaeological evidence to support Olga's position in the Rus, but not enough to prove all of the entries in the tale of bygone years are legitimately how they happened. But to do away and disregard the first century of the narrative of the tale of bygone years as legendary, as exaggerated, does a disservice to what we do know and what we can find out from the primary chronicle, because the way I described how the Christian compilers wrote of Olga as a heathen, as a barbarian who is an example of, look how bad you can be and still be saved and forgiven for your sins and convert to Christianity. We can still infer a great deal of important contextual information. So historically, she's not been looked at favourably. I do hope that changes with these re-examinations, and I do hope that this opens up a new avenue for looking at figures in the tale of bygone years in that first century.
Mm-hmm. And so what lessons can we learn from St. Olga's leadership style and diplomatic strategies in negotiating political challenges?
First of all, don't mess with Olga.
Oh, definitely not. No.
Because she's very politically clever. She knows how to work political situations to her favour. There's no way that she managed to commit the revenge that she did without her political ability. To end a 100-day siege that didn't look like it was going to end anytime soon, she convinced the people of Iskorsistan to pay her tribute of swallows and pigeons, and she tied sulfur to them, sent them back home to roost, had her army fire arrows of flame into the city, and up goes the entire city of Iskorsistan, setting it aflame. She was able to navigate politics extremely well, and she continues to use this wit and charisma in the Byzantine Empire, where she is said to have been able to brush off a marriage proposal from Emperor Constantine, despite the fact he was already married, so we don't know how legitimate that is, by saying, you've baptized me, you are my godfather in the Christian faith, I cannot marry my father. Like, you know, we're going to follow your doctrine. So she's very good at using cultural, political, religious frameworks to her advantage. And I think that's a great lesson that we can use today, because you can't just blindly impose something on people without understanding their culture, because culture, history, legacy, language, religion, they make up a people, and Olga was really good at understanding that.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. How does St. Olga's story fit into the broader narrative of women's roles in medieval European history?
In a broader sense, she fits into a class of women who have been disregarded, who are getting the examination that they deserve at the moment. I think there are so many women who have been great rulers during the medieval period who have been diminished, their excellence diminished. And I think she unfortunately falls into that class of women. But I do think she was an incredibly strong woman who really characterizes the strength that women had to have, and the strength that women did have in the period that we are continually discovering. So yeah.
Excellent. What do you hope readers will take away from your book about St. Olga and her impact on Kievan Rus?
First of all, I hope that they take away that the Rus is not Russia, it's not Belarus, it's not Ukraine. The Rus is the Rus. It is not a history of just Russia. It is a shared common history of many East Slavic states and peoples. The second thing I hope to take away is that Olga has been viewed in a completely Christian lens in almost all examinations of her previously, as few as they may be. So I hope that people take away that Christianity is not the only lens that we can view her through, and just because she did convert to Christianity doesn't mean that her life before Christianity as a practitioner of Slavic and Scandinavian traditions was any less important, just because it is considered legendary. I hope that people take away that Saint Olga of Kyiv was a legitimately incredible figure in history that should be taken seriously, and pretty much up there with the greatest rulers of all time, essentially, is what I hope they take away. Whether that happens or not, completely different other story.
I'm sure it will. And so obviously she's left this legacy in Ukraine and around that area where the Rus were. And so are there any churches, monuments dedicated to Olga? Obviously you wouldn't be able to visit them at the moment, but as we know why, but we won't get into that. But yeah, just say to give us an idea of what there is.
So there is, you can find it on the actual website for Iskorsistan, or Korsten, which is the modern day city of the capital city of the Derevlians. There is a shrine to Olga on a lake, which is where Olga is said to have bathed when she was coming and setting up tribute and sieging the Derevlians. But also, if you go back to the other slide, this is a monument to her outside St. Michael's Cathedral in Kiev. And I think what is really beautiful about this monument is, to her left, you have St. Andrew, who is pointing at the mountain range outside of Kiev. And to the right, you have Cyril and Methodius, who were the first people who introduced a written language to the Slavic people, which became Old Church Slavonic, which is what we have the Tale of Bygone Years written in. So it's a really nice monument that speaks to a great amount of history of Kiev that she is included in, and she has already been included in. So I think there is a great sense of national pride in who Olga is in Ukraine. Obviously, I'm not Ukrainian, so I can't speak to that specifically, but that is the sense that I've gotten through my research. And I think it's incredible that there is this monument here for her amongst incredible people who have really shaped Slavic and history within this area.
Okay, thanks for that. And I must ask, have you, obviously before the trouble started in that region, have you managed to get out to, visit some of these places yourself?
So unfortunately, I never was able to travel to Ukraine. I have traveled to Russia on several occasions and visited Vladimir, which is a city named after Vladimir the Great and was a seat of great importance in Christianity. Beautiful, beautiful places in Suzdal and Morum as well. But no, unfortunately, I never made it to Ukraine. I didn't have the time between studying and my year abroad, and then COVID hit. So my plan was, I was supposed to go to Ukraine after my year abroad. Mm-hmm. I was in Russia during 2019 to 2020, and obviously then travel shut down, and then the war against Ukraine broke out as well. So I've not unfortunately not been able to travel there.
I know COVID is got so many things to answer for. One of the reasons why I started a podcast, actually. But anyway, yes. So any last thoughts? I always like to say to people, any last thoughts before we wrap up the podcast, because you might have something that you maybe forgot to say or I forgot to ask.
I don't think there's anything that I've forgotten to say. Your questions you've asked incredible questions. I would like to say, go and research female figures in history. It doesn't need to be Saint Olga of Kyiv. I mean, it would be incredible if you did go and away and research her yourself. But there are so many female figures in history who have been forgotten and whose voices have been erased and edited. And it would be incredible if just one of you went out and found a woman who you had never heard of before.
Thank you. And all that's left to say, ladies and gentlemen, is thank you, Abby.
No, thank you for having me on. Thank you for giving me a platform. I'm really excited. I'm really excited to be here and to be recording with you.
Thank you. And all that's left to say again is cheers.
Cheers.
Thanks for tuning in for this latest episode of For the Passion of History podcast, which was brought to you by American Civil War and UK history. To keep up to date with everything American Civil War and UK history, head over to our website where you will find links to all of our social media pages, blog posts and podcasts. Link can be found in the podcast description. And a massive big thank you to Abigail. You will find a link to Abigail's Instagram page in the show's description. All that's left to say is thank you for listening or watching. We'll see you all soon. Cheers.